Hi there, Steve Coffin. I want to continue, in a way, in the same vein as my previous video where I talked about, the role of the classroom teacher. And I want to have this as an exchange with language teachers and language learners. And I noticed that a few teachers did comment on my last video. And I think it would be great if we could really have a discussion, and then maybe in a subsequent video I can refer to some of these comments. Certainly some of the comments that I received to my last video were along the lines of, I tell my students that the grades don't matter. I tell my students that they need to spend time with the language. They don't do it, and in fact I saw an article on the internet about some new way of teaching languages that involves the teacher, giving them a lecture on some subject, and some kids found it interesting and other kids were asleep in the class. So yeah, there are some real problems in the classroom. Not everyone is going to be motivated. But I refer to this talk as what I call the art of language learning. And that's what I want to get some feedback on. If we can establish what the skill is in language learning, that might be helpful. And so that if the teacher can sort of inculcate, at least for those who are interested, the art of language learning, how you go about language learning, and what the key elements are, then that might be helpful. Obviously, having a good attitude, like being motivated, is not an art. It's a condition for success, but it's not the essence of the art of language learning. Spending the time is also a condition of success, and it's probably dependent on your motivation, but it's also not in the sort of, in that sense, the art of language learning. And people always say to me, for example, oh, well, you just have a knack for language learning. And that's undoubtedly true because I have done it so often. If you do anything a lot, you're going to get good at it. But the implication almost is that you were born with a skill for language learning. You were born with some gene for language learning. And a lot of people convince themselves that they don't have this gene and some other people do have this gene. And of course, I've always said that that can't be true because if you go to certain countries like Sweden, a lot of people speak foreign languages very well. I don't believe the Swedes have some special genetic predisposition for language learning. So, but they have some of the other things going for them, like a lot of exposure to the language. But let's move away from the motivation and the time that we spend with the language, and let's just look at what it takes to learn a language. What is this art of language learning? What is this skill that we have to develop? And I think it boils down to this third element of my trinity, motivation, time on task, and the third one is noticing. It's developing the ability to notice what's happening in the language. And that's why I feel that in teaching in the classroom, if the emphasis were on understanding and developing the ability to notice the language, which in a way is it's not passive, but you're not having to produce the language. You just have to notice what's happening in the language. I once called language learning like doing a jigsaw puzzle. So once you have enough of the pieces in place, you can start speaking, but until you have the pieces in place, until you have a sense of the structure of the language, until you have a sense or at least a significant vocabulary, you can't say very much. So there shouldn't be this emphasis on producing the language and the correct production of the language. We shouldn't give the kids or the learner the expectation that they're going to learn to speak particularly quickly, because they aren't. And even if they did learn to say a few things, it wouldn't get them very far, because language is two-way communication, and if you can say something and you don't understand what people are saying to you, then it's not much use. So take away the obligation or the illusion that they're going to learn to speak quickly, and say your task is to understand the language and to notice what's happening. So one thing that is for sure is that just as with a jigsaw puzzle, if you were given 3 or 4 or 5 big pieces to the jigsaw puzzle, some of the smaller pieces might start to make sense to you. But when you don't have anything in front of you, not even really a picture, because you have no sense of this language, all the little pieces, all the grammatical explanations, all the tables of endings, none of these things have any lasting effect. You can study them until your eyes get tired, and they aren't going to have much impact. And I noticed this, for example, in Russian. The endings for say, even in the nominative plural, there's different E endings. Some is that funny ui, some is the E. I never paid much attention to it. I read all the explanations, soft consonants, hard consonants, no lasting impact. But when enough of the other pieces are in place, now you're left with a few little tidbits which often seem to be easy to explain, but which simply don't stick. They don't stick until later on. So the first thing to understand is that the things that we can notice when we start are different from the things that we will notice later on. And the more we have things in place, the more we notice. So how can we get students to notice? Or how can we train ourselves to notice? Well, I think if I were teaching a language, I would begin by pointing out only the most obvious things in a general way, and either reading with the class, or if we had a screen and we could maybe use different highlighting for certain aspects of the language. For example, it's enough to say that in French there is gender. Notice that there is le and la. Fine. Notice that if you wanted to get to the point where, say, to tell them that there is agreement, but never with the idea that they have to remember it, and they have to remember which nouns are masculine and which are feminine. They aren't going to remember those things. Similarly in tense, saying, there are different tenses in the Romance languages, in English. Talk about the generalities. In Japanese, they have these little, watashi wa. In other words, a little comma after the subject of a sentence, or anata ni, like the wa and the ni, indicate the direction of, it's sort of like a preposition that comes after the noun. All of these things can be pointed out in a very general way and say, but don't worry about that. I'm just pointing out a few things, and we want you to read and listen and try to accumulate words and get some sense of what the little story is about. That's the other thing. I said in my previous video that if you see a list of, let's say, 10 sentences that all contain a particular pattern, that can help you notice. But that's only true after you've had a lot of exposure to the language, I realized on reconsidering. Because if you begin with that, it's just too much. It doesn't mean anything. It's been explained to you that there's a dative case. You kind of vaguely understand that happens, but you have no real feel for it. So you still have to begin with simple stories, so that at least the story, however dumb the story is, 20-second little story, hello, how are you, what's your name, it has some sense. There is something there that people can identify with, because they can understand that, that sort of also has meaning in my language. This is how they say it in that language. Listen to it, save words, and maybe have it pointed out that there are some things happening there. For example, this language doesn't use prepositions. The endings of the nouns change. Just some very general suggestions along those lines, and have the learners focus initially on the content, because they have to get somehow the big pieces of the jigsaw puzzle filled out. But then there are things that I notice that I do to help me notice. When I review my vocabulary, and I have a lot of vocabulary, I don't do it with the intention that I'll remember them. But I'm always interested in the connections between words, because that helps me notice. Because there's lots of words that sound the same initially. And so if in LingQ, for example, I can search by root word, I can search by prefix or suffix, and so I can see words that contain some of the same components and see which ones are connected and which ones in fact are quite different. And I don't necessarily remember all of that, but it helps me notice. Next time I see that word, because I have spent some time seeing how it was similar to or different from some other words, I kind of notice it a little bit better. Even when I work in Lincoln, I save phrases because it's a certain pattern. Even the act of saving that phrase helps me to notice it. And then if I tag it, as I often do, that will eventually give me a list of 10 or 20 or 30 words or phrases that contain the same pattern, and then I can review them together. And reviewing them in flashcards or multiple choice, or we now have dictation, all of these things are just different ways of going over these words and phrases, watching for patterns. And in focusing on some of these patterns, then the next time you listen to something or you read something, again, you'll be just that much more likely to notice it. And if you develop the ability to notice, your understanding is going to improve. At a later stage, when you feel confident enough to speak, of course, the speaking also helps you notice, because you notice where you struggle to find a word. But at the beginning, you struggle so much that it's just overwhelming. You can't give people too much to notice at first. You have to build up a base so that a few things stick out, and those things might be different in the first 3 months, second 3 months, third 3 months, and so forth. So cultivating this ability to notice, and then later on, as you're speaking, you may want to record your voice and to listen to how you sound versus how the native speaker sounds. But again, I wouldn't do that until you're well along, because initially trying to make the sounds of the new language is simply too difficult. I wouldn't attempt to, and in my experience, I don't attempt to pronounce until I've had a lot of exposure to the language. So I feel that if teachers could somehow reduce the expectations that either learners make of themselves or that we make of the learners. In other words, the expectation that they're going to speak correctly, they're going to be able to apply these grammar rules. I think those are all unrealistic expectations. If the expectation is you're going to learn to understand the language, you're going to get to where you can comfortably listen and read and understand more and more of the language because you're going to increase your vocabulary. And along the way, you are going to take the initiative in starting to notice the patterns. And as a teacher, we can help you. We can spend a day on or a lesson on a particular pattern, pointing out where it occurs. Maybe have it on a screen with some highlighting, pointing out these patterns, pointing out relationships between words, eventually looking at word lists that the students have gleaned from their reading and listening, and identifying some of the relationships in terms of patterns and so forth. And of course, focusing then eventually on specific patterns, and then doing it in different ways that might involve competition between groups of students or between individual students, but all in a light-hearted way, and with the understanding that any correction, any sort of wrong answer, is not going to detract from their mark. It's not a black mark against them. It's simply a step in the process of increasing our ability to notice what's happening in the language. So I've kind of rambled a bit, and I probably may not have been as clear as I would like, but I believe this ability, cultivating the ability to notice, is at the core of the art of language learning. So that if we put in the time, if we have a positive attitude, and we can notice what's happening, we will eventually learn to speak. And I know this is a fact from my Russian studies, most recently, where I spent, I would say, at least 2 years without speaking, and I haven't spoken very much. Last night I was at a dinner with 20 Russian people here, a Russian language meetup in Vancouver, and it was a little difficult because 5 conversations were going, across each other, and I couldn't hear so clearly. It's not like listening to the radio where you are, the person is just talking to you. But I was doing fine. I was quite able to, carry on hold up my end of the conversation, not having spoken very much at all. So if you devote yourself to comprehension, if you devote yourself to noticing, the brain will pick up on these patterns. The brain will do it. You have to trust the brain, but you can help it along with doing things that help you notice. Or conversely, the teacher can help you by helping you to notice. And in that sense, again, I'm not in agreement with the extreme crashenists who believe you just do a lot of extensive reading content that's 95%, consisting of known words. I just think that takes far, far too long, and I think there are things that we can do to help you notice the language and also to help you to learn your words faster. So, a bit of a ramble, a bit of a longer ramble, but mostly I'm interested in getting some feedback both from learners and teachers as to whether, there isn't something there that we can change the nature of language teaching and make it more about cultivating the ability to notice and encouraging people to notice. And maybe even learners who are not motivated by the language can be motivated if there's some kind of a game in uncovering and unraveling a mystery or discovering the language on their own and finding examples of these patterns like a treasure hunt in some text. So, and of course, it may well be that I'm totally unrealistic because I've never taught a language class, so I look forward to all kinds of comments, both positive and negative, and I'm sorry that I dragged on so long. Thank you, and Merry Christmas if I don't speak to you sooner.